This is the Change Physician, episode 201. Welcome back to the Change Physician. I'm Melissa Katie, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, to bring you a topic of interest that has a whole bunch of ideas, I guess, for us to smile more, be happier, going into older age, I guess you should say. We're kind of middle age, I guess, getting up there.
We've got these arbitrary definitions, like
I know it's relative.
It's all relative, but everything that we perceive comes from a point of reference. The point of reference is where you are at now, and so my particular point of reference is I'm not obviously just out of residency or fellowship anymore. I'm not, I'm approaching the 5-0 next year, and I'm also on that threshold of change where you're approaching that whole idea of like retirement, or what are you going to next, where you're no longer having to work. And that has been lots of thought has gone into this stuff, because one of the things that there's some data around is if people who retire from something to nothing, they tend to die. And that's typically people if you work till whatever 75. I have no intention of doing that. But I think we even did the episode on what do you do with your time, right? So I'm thinking about this a lot. Like, what am I going to do with my time? What am I going to do with my time? I'm trying to be very proactive about this. But there was an article that came up in the Atlantic, and I really liked the title of it. And then it, of course, made me go into a little bit more detail. And it was the 7 habits that lead to happiness in old age. Super cool thing about this, like from a marketing standpoint, 1, there's a number. 2, they have a very specific end result, happiness in old age for a very specific audience. So it's actually a gorgeous headline because it targeted me perfectly, because one of the things that you wanted to do is be happy. But what the article was sort of a summation of there's a Harvard study that some people will probably be familiar with. It has been going on since 1938, when Harvard took a number of their graduates. They were all white men at the time. And then they've been following them longitudinally from that date. And then they've been publishing kind of data around them. And one of them is, how, who's living longer, what are their self reports of happiness and contentment are, and then kind of doing this kind of retrospective analysis on what tends to be associated with healthy living, with living longer, and then with that sense of happiness, right? Because you can live a long time, but you may not be happy. Although, if you're not happy, you tend not to live a long time. So anyway, I would like to go through these 7 habits that lead to happiness as you age, and they also tend to be associated with better health. And we have a little discussion on the importance of these, because I'm sure that you will recognize some of these. And old age being that's such a stupid term. Let's just say over the age of 50, right? So once you're getting into your 70s, these are the habits where they're associated with being healthy and happy as a 70-plus-year-old, which to me is actually super young. You ready? Okay. First one. This is now. Some of these aren't going to be mind blowing. Such as number 1. Don't smoke.
Check.
But I want to bring this in because there's some. So don't smoke, and then number 2 is watch your drinking. And the comment being on alcohol abuse, and it's really you're kind of looking at substance use disorders. There's 2 factors of this, though. One is one of the reasons I think smoking is so inherently kind of deadly is because of the physiologic effects. Like, we know it just rampages your body, all those free radicals and the nicotine, and it just rampages essentially every body system. But the thing that not a lot of people don't get talked about is the idea of resiliency associated with it. So both excessive drinking as well as smoking are passive coping mechanisms. And so there is actually data when you're looking, if you are going to an external modality in order to reduce your stress, that passive modality tends to not do well. I mean, you actually are a more stressed out individual. So I found that as is interesting based on both the physiologic, but also the psychologic side. And so I want, that kind of the parallel being for me is look how you cope with tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
If you're reaching for the bottle, not good. If you're reaching for the cigarette or drug, or the big one now is CBD and marijuana, again, not good. And if you're learning more of that internal skill, some of which we talk about here on the Trained Physician, again, associated with better aging. So I will pause there since I've talked so much. And what do you think about those first two? Was your mind blown by those first two?
No, but you made me think about the resilience factor of the coping aspect, and how we've talked about habits before, and maybe if you think about, we all have stress in some form or another, some more than others, some more dramatic or intense than others. I guess it's all relative, but depending on your environment, of course, if you're raised in an environment where both parents are smokers, or your peers smoke, you may start the habit, maybe not initially as a means of coping, but it's now wired in your system what you find beneficial from it or what you like about it. And so you get the trigger, the stress, the boredom, whatever it is, and you reach for it. And so a lot of times we talk about, if you recognize that pause, that feeling, and you acknowledge it and you're aware of it and you realize what is really happening, and you can substitute something more active and less passive to deal with that stressor, then that can, put you in a position of change, and keeping that going so that you rewire that process. So anytime you get those feelings, you create a different habit based off of that. So yeah, that's what it made me think of. And no, I'm not surprised.
Although it is interesting because you brought up a bunch of points about habituation and the environment that you're in. And that does that, like, you could see how something originally happened or became a point of, oh, I'm doing this because it makes me feel good. Or as in my family, we all smoke cigarettes after dinner. I don't know if anybody
Fun people smoke.
Fun people smoke.
That.
And then it becomes this, that then anytime that you're craving that sort of sense of contentment while you're reaching for it. The one point I want to kind of hone in on, because I became aware of this, and I think I mentioned this in one of our Saturday salutations. So if you guys aren't on Saturday salutations, join us on Facebook at noon Pacific time on Saturdays, generally most of the time. But was I think I talked about anger. Like, I get triggered pretty easily. And so I was trying to do some exercises around. So obviously anger is not smoking, but it's still a reflex of action. And I was trying to divide strategies about becoming aware of it to interrupt it. And ultimately that wasn't doing too well. And I came to the conclusion that part of it is, if you're using awareness as a key step to interrupt a habit chain, then the only really proactive step that you can take is to actually increase the training that you have of awareness, so that you can actually increase the skill of becoming aware in order to become aware of these habit chains, such as smoking or drinking, reflexive kind of actions, in order to do that. And the only way I found to do, the only way I've kind of thought about is probably through meditation. So I just wanted to add that in there, because we talk about habit chains, or being able to just break these things about smoking and drinking. We know those are very difficult. But what can you do to be more proactive about doing that? How can you build a skill that increases your level of awareness in order to interrupt that habit chain?
And let me make one last comment about that. Is some particular things we reach for, whether it's caffeine or alcohol, if you have an habituation for a long period of time, that your body tends to freak out if it goes cold turkey. And a lot of times you have to kind of trick the body into thinking it's not being deprived of that particular substance. So just want to make a comment that sometimes you have to just ease out of it instead of go cold turkey, because the physiological withdrawal symptoms can be pretty powerful and make it even doubly or triply hard to make that change.
We just opened up another can of worms, because there's another super fascinating thing. Alan Carr had this book on how to quit smoking. And it's a lot of people will swear by this book, that you read the book and you can quit smoking. But what I loved, I actually bought the book, is it's very along the line of it's kind of a sales letter, meaning it sort of builds up this idea about smoking, but the way he framed like withdrawal to cigarettes was, instead of saying it's a response because you're not taking that, the way of basically saying as well, because you're having withdrawals is because you're the absence of the substance. He's saying, he reframed it to be your jitters and with all the stuff that you are experiencing is because you've been covering that with the substance. And it was a brilliant little reframe in there. I was like, oh my God, that is just a gorgeous way to say it, because now you're basically ascribing the negative symptoms that you don't like to the actual process that you're trying to get rid of, rather than vice versa. And anyway, so that was Alan Carr's How to Quit Smoking, which was published like 30 years ago, but it was kind of interesting. Just kind of a reframe.
Yeah, pick which way works for you. I don't pick your adventure.
Yeah, pick your adventure. All right, so number 3, are you ready?
What was number 2?
Number 2 was the drinking. So number 1 was don't smoke, if you already smoke, quit. Number 2 was drinking. Watch your drinking. Alcohol abuse being strongly correlated with smoking. I had to bring those two in together because of that whole passive coping kind of style associated with it. Number 3, though, and this one will, if you've been a long time listener here, you probably have never heard this before, but it was maintain a healthy body weight. Eat lots of vegetables and fruits. Can you believe that one? Yeah.
Yeah. Those good micronutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber, the real food versus the processed. Yeah.
Well, and one of the interesting things I would be kind of, we need like someone who's really good at nutrition, because I haven't dived into the data very much, but like, what's your physiologic and emotional state associated with different types of foods? Right. So, because we always talk about the kind of the physical effects and the effects of processed foods, but I don't know, like you eat sugar, you get a little quick brush, but then you get that kind of low and you kind of feel crappy.
Yeah, because you get glycemic index spike and you dropped and you just plummet. I mean, there's no steady blood glucose. It's up and down and it messes with you. And then
I would be more interested in like what type of foods, or if there is any true data on it, what foods have to be associated with better, I don't even know, how would you, like, more sense of well-being. Like when you eat them, there's a greater sense of well-being.
Well, I mean, from what I've read, and not being a complete expert in personal anecdotal experience, along with that, it's very consistent. My anecdotal experience and what I've read is, obviously proteins and, healthy proteins and fats, and that's a very generic statement. And greens that obviously have fiber, which fiber, even if you had sugar, which, it helps stabilize and keeps the blood sugar from spiking. I mean, those in general, if I'm eating clean, meaning I'm eating lots of greens, I don't really eat tons of fruits, but at least you have the fiber blended in with that. And I'm having some, the macronutrients, some fats, some proteins that go with it. I feel great. But when I start throwing in some jelly beans or something else, and then all of a sudden you feel like you need a nap when you could have been super uber productive and your brain would have been a lot sharper. So yeah, you can manipulate how you feel.
Interesting stuff. Yes. So that was number 3. So number 4, again, a really tough one here, is prioritize movement in your life by scheduling time for it every day and sticking to it.
I love it.
I love it too. Yeah.
But
I guess one of the things I wanted to kind of pull up on this stuff is, so this is from the Atlantic, the 7 Habits, that was based on George Valiant was the physician who was kind of head of the study for like 50 years. I think he's recently retired, coming out of Harvard. But they're specifically framing this to a successful aging later in life. And we still have 3 more to go to. But what I find really fascinating about this is this: if you were 5 years old, it's the same stuff. So there's a universality behind it. so why, we frame it in such a way, the 7 habits that lead to happiness as you get older or after the age of 50 or whatever the case may be. I love universality. I love these things that are foundational, that are not like specific to the subpopulation, because if you can find these general rules and incorporate them, those are like the big, powerful levers in your life, rather than these little, dinky things that people love to run around and, oh, if you take coenzyme Q, that's the greatest thing in the world. Well, no, that's a super small little dinky ass lever that somebody's using to sell a supplement versus these big ones. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, you could be downing a whole bunch of, alcohol every day and taking all the supplements in the world. It didn't matter if you're killing yourself with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
All right. Number 5, practice your coping mechanisms now. The earlier you find healthy ways to deal with life's inevitable distresses, the more prepared you'll be if ill luck strikes at your 80s. And we had an off-air conversation about stress and resiliency. So anything that you can do to help manage stress, and I would say that the earlier ages that you can get that in, like no age is too late to start on this stuff, but you certainly want to do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of how well people cope with, society stressors, life stressors, pandemic, shift in your work environment, no longer work in the office, not having people around you. I mean, you got to find ways to like make yourself more well, feel better, or as I say, pivot, shift, modify. Same thing. It reminds me of not just like coping mechanisms for just like what people consider just mental stuff, but even physically, if you get injured. I hear all the time. I'm always just baffled by someone gets injured and they stop altogether, no movement. I'm like, whoa, pivot, modify. What can you do? Well, this is what I always do. And it's such a very linear, narrow-minded approach to movement. I'm like, no, you can do other stuff. Let me just show you about 5 or 10 different things you can do since you can't use your knee right now. I get pretty passionate about that because I'm like, you can't even modify your movement.
And it's because, again, the data supports that, right? I mean, the old days when 50 years ago, and they would have people lay up in a hospital bed for weeks at bed rest, we were killing people.
Yeah.
And you look more and more at the data, even when you have things like joint replacements or surgery, like bowel surgery, the goal is to get using it in the soonest possible interval that you can. Static or not moving is bad. Not good for you. Now, obviously, you're not saying if you broke your leg that you want to run around on an unstable fracture or whatever, but you definitely want to still be moving. And the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about that was, oh yeah, don't move and get a DVT. So deep vein thrombosis, because you haven't been moving, because our bodies don't like not moving.
Right. So this ties into the previous principle and the current one you just said. And I actually had a patient come to me for a case, found out from the previous surgery, the wife insisted that he not move. They said, stay, she's like, you need to stay in bed. And so she insisted that he not move. He got a DVT and a PE.
Oh my God.
And she basically, even though he wanted to move around, his body was telling him to do, something. She insisted, and she caused it, in essence. I mean, in all honesty. So anyway, yeah. People, you gotta I don't know. Sometimes I'm always astounded by some of the things that happen without being able to modify and understand the general principles too. So
yeah, it is kind of mind blowing. So many places we can go with that.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not gonna. All right. So number 6 here. So we said, number 1, don't smoke. Number 2, watch your drinking. Number 3, maintain a healthy body weight. Number 4, prioritize movement. I forgot to add that the time tested way, and we've actually talked about this, is if you're not doing anything, walk. Walk. And this is speaking from me. I don't go on walks, but I know it's like the best thing to do. I do other forms of movement, but walking, if you are making an excuse that you can't exercise at all, everybody can walk, unless you can't walk, in which case you still have to move in some different way.
Yeah.
All right. Practice your coping mechanisms now. that probably needs to get expanded on so many different levels. Number 6, though, is to keep learning. More education leads to a more active mind in old age, which tends to translate to a longer, happier life in general. And that has, the Atlantic article obviously is not less scientific, but when you look at the study, they talk about socioeconomic status. So we know that a higher socioeconomic status, somebody who's born in a family of more wealth or means in a better area, tends to live longer lives. And there's both the reason, the kind of the physical reason, you may have better nutrition, et cetera. But there is also the psychological reason associated with it as well, where there's change in mindset, there's change in perspective, there's change in psychological safety, all these other elements that people may not think, like even you just pull yourself up in your bootstraps, even though you're grown up in the ghetto and that's all that you can do. But there's a lot more to it than just that. But incorporating learning where you have this flexible brain, then I think is an important skill also with the one before where they were talking about psychological coping. Because if you don't know how to learn, then you can't acquire these skills, some of which are very necessary for both the physiologic processes as well as the psychological processes. And it keeps your brain growing. Again, we talked about static being bad for the body.
Mm-hmm.
Static on the brain is bad for your brain.
Which is part of your body. It's all about moving, pivoting, adapting. And if you're not doing those things, all those principles, it's hard to stay with those.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you can bioplasticity, neuroplasticity. There's all kind of things you can talk about related to learning. But yeah, I mean,
I was having a conversation about this with my kids the other day about learning, just in general. I didn't know how to learn. And I've said this. I didn't really learn how to learn until I was like 38 years old.
Yeah.
And so many people go to school and they think the purpose of learning is to do well on a test and go to the next test. That is not what the point of learning is. And so many, there are people that it's like graduate from high school and then just they're done. It just blows my freaking mind now. I don't know. Always be learning.
Yeah. Well, you got to have a thirst for it, or there's got to be a motivation there. I don't know. I think there's some people that naturally are inquisitive and ask questions and ask why. I think children, when they're young, you hear why mom and dad, why can't I do that?
Yeah.
But what is it that, and I think it may be indoctrinated within the system and how we put these children into some, I guess, I'm not a parent of kids in public school or anything, but I do think there's a system and this passivity to you must learn this, you must know this, and spit it out, and we're just going to grade you on that, but not the processing part of that, because you spitting out something, the depth of your knowledge of that can be radically different than somebody else that answered it correctly, also. So how well they're embedding it and applying it to life, if it even really applies a lot to life, I guess the question too. But yes, agreed.
All right, so that was number 6. And then number 7, cultivate the work for stable long-term relationships now. For most people, this includes a steady marriage, but others would be relationships with friends, family, partners, etc. And that point of connection has come up. So this is the Harvard data, but if we talked about blue zones before, it's the same thing. It's this sense of connection with others that we may think is not important actually has pretty strong correlation to health in aging and satisfaction with the aging process. I have a couple more, but I'm gonna stop for a second so I don't have to talk all over you. I feel
it's okay. No, you have the list there. I mean, I think relationships, connection, community, we're social beings. All these other things you talked about are kind of like personal coping. in the environment, but that number 7, if they didn't have that number 7, I'd say it's not a good enough list. Like there is that component. And the thing is, it's unique, is that to be the best version of yourself, as you hear it many times, or to personally develop yourself, is to make yourself better for the connections and the community. And so the individual, willingness to, not smoke or minimize drinking, keep it in moderation, or not at all, whatever the choice. Obviously, it's legally, socially acceptable. I mean, technically, smoking is legal, but
Well, and there's that conflicting data on alcohol as well. Like one drink might be okay,
yeah,
but I think that's one of those little small levers. Like literally, don't drink a drink because you think that's going to be a major lever on life as compared to these other ones. If you do drink, then the one drink I think is fine.
Yeah, well, if you have all these other things and your immune system's, we know your immune system is decreased by alcohol, and so you got to keep that into account. And some people might be more vulnerable. As we get older, we may feel effects more. So some people naturally stop drinking because they just don't feel good. That's probably a good sign from your body there. But all these other things, and how you eat, and all those personal things that you try to enhance your own overall, your well-being, joy. Of course, we're talking about happiness. If your body is functioning well, your mind is functioning well, then you're going to be better for the people in your life, and you can have a more fulfilling, many times. Now, smokers would say they are a lot more fun, and they would have a different opinion about this. But in general, I mean, we know that all these things are beneficial. So I think sometimes it's a big struggle for the kind of society we live in right now. And the isolation we've had recently, more so than at other times. And so I think it complicates it, but there's no doubt that you still have to find a way, to create these important relationships that have meaning, not just, oh, I've got 1,000 followers. Obviously, that's not as meaningful. Just like even we were talking about, the great, your school and learning, and you can just like superficially learn something and not truly learn it. You can also have superficial relationships that really don't bring you depth or joy. So, it doesn't mean you have to have a ton of really close friends, but, it's important to have more than one, because if something happens to them, then how are you going to be with coping? How are you going to be with connection? Might feel harder as you get older to meet someone new that relates to you. So, might be good to have friends in different generations. They're not just, going to die. You're 90 years old and everyone that you knew dies, So obviously family can provide that too, multi-generational. But those are some thoughts.
Well, and you bring up a good point though. And part of it being is we talk about these 7 sort of broad factors, but they are very interrelated. Mm-hmm. Because that process of learning also includes, just like you said, the process of developing new friends. And I think about that with my grandparents all the time. My grandfather was an incredibly healthy individual. He went through 2 sets of friends that died. Like the first set died, and then the other ones were like 10 or 20 years younger than them, and then those died. And I think it got to the point where he just didn't want to do it anymore. And my grandmother had some health issues and things at the time that was pretty stressful. But I'm firmly convinced he could have lived a lot longer if he had been more engaged. Like if he maybe, and nothing to say, maybe he was just tired. When people get tired and you just want to be done, I'm totally okay with that. But on the flip side, I miss my grandfather quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so if you're interested in that learning thing, or making sure that you learn, that also engages, you can learn those other things such as new friends, coping strategies, et cetera, as well. Now, the one thing I want to do to end this, so this is mostly from the Harvard data, but there's been a number of different aging studies produced since. And so this one actually came out of Norway, and this was Lifestyle Predictors of Successful Aging. And this was a 20-year perspective study that they started with 50-year-olds and then followed them up to age 70. And they kind of took all of this data from the old Harvard stuff and started doing some analysis of these subcategories to find which ones were the most powerful, which 2 do you think were the most powerful? And so let me go back. So if you're listening here, so you get those. Which two of these? Don't smoke, watch your drinking, maintain a healthy body weight, prioritize movement, practice coping mechanisms, learning, and then connection and long-term relationships being number 7.
Long-term relationships would be 1, and movement
Close.
or learning.
No.
What is it?
It's long-term relationships
Uh-huh.
and smoking.
Oh, see, that was the other one that was next. But
Well, and here's the thing that I think fascinating about it, because if we kind of took about psychological and physiological well-being, we know it's like smoking is by far like the worst thing that you can do. Like that is bad. On the physical side. The psychological side, though, it also is a measure of passing coping style. So then we can bring that metric in. We know that social connection is a very powerful health mediator, right? So if you are connected to your tribe, you tend to have lower distress, you have more contentment. So that's this massive stress reducer in there. If you have strong social connections, generally, then you have some ability to learn. And there's some, I would say, I would actually, this is a question that makes me want to look into. My assumption then is you have strong and healthy relationships, you're less likely to use passive coping mechanisms. And so, but that's my kind of explanation is why those two seem to came out really well. Is I think that they reflect kind of all the other ones. So they're these core outcome measures rather than just an endpoint of their own. Like to have healthy relationships in such a way, you have to be able to learn, develop, have good coping, not only personal, but interpersonal coping mechanisms. And then smoking is such an easy one because it has such a huge, profound physiological impact on you, but it also has that association with passive coping style. So if you're not a smoker and you're not defaulting to that behavior, you may not be as likely to fall back onto passive coping mechanisms to tolerate or to deal with external stressors in your life. So that's just my sort of explanation for those two. But I did find it kind of interesting. If you only had to focus on 2, make good friends, keep good friends, and don't smoke.
yeah, and it's interesting because learning requires a good brain, and you can optimize by, you don't want to advance atherosclerosis and a potential stroke from having a smoking history. Your obviously alcohol can impact your brain, your nervous system, not just acutely but chronically. The food that you eat can also optimize your brain for learning. And there's plenty of studies to show that if you want to really, sleeping, getting some sleep after you learn something, and then the next day, and then review that again can be very powerful. But if you move before you do your learning, you can actually improve your ability to learn. So I found that kind of fascinating when you look at how they all tie together. So, yeah,
absolutely.
And if you do it together, you might learn more because you're more, you have accountability and you learn it and you can talk about it and you can reinforce.
I should learn together, like with your study buddies.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can have the you should like little study clubs as the over 50 study buddies we're going to study how to live till
Book club.
Yeah, the study club.
Yeah, there you go.
The centenarian club. That would be awesome.
I love it. Yeah, those are good.
All right. Well, those were the 7 habits associated with healthy aging that came from the Atlantic. The 7 habits that lead to happiness in old age is the actual title by Arthur C. Brooks. Again, that is based on, because really it's based on actual data coming from those Harvard studies that have been done longitudinally. George Valiant being the physician who was like a longtime caretaker of that information. Again, I think he recently retired. And that's it. That's it for my end. So go out and live healthy.
That's right.
All right. Am I supposed to end this one or are you ending this one?
Yeah, I started it. If you want to end it.
All right. Well, folks, if you want to join the Change Physician community, you can find us at thechangephysician.com, where you can develop some connections with us and us with you. Maybe we can age together for the next 50 years. And if you want to connect on a more live basis, join us at Facebook Lives every Saturday, generally between 12 Pacific and 2. or 2 p.m. Central Time or 3 p.m. Eastern Time. But you can always find us on your favorite podcast media. And until next time, stay well.
Take care.